Today, my challenge is not to go on all day. So I realize we have work to do this morning, but I do want to cover a few things that I thought would be worth sharing, and I want to put it in the context of our industry. We recently went through an electric rate increase, so that my mind is sort of thinking about electric right now. And in thinking about electric, and especially thinking about rates, it's hard not to put that in context of what's going on in the industry. Come on in. Come on in. Good morning. Good morning. So our electric industry is changing, and yes, water and gas has their evolutionary changes as well, and certainly gas has seen dramatic changes in the last 10 years in terms of supply costs. But the electric industry is really going through a redefinition of who it is and what it is and how it's structured and the types of services it ought to provide. And I thought it would be useful just to do a little 101 to make sure that all of us in this industry sort of understood that industry framework a little bit. And one of the first things, we're going to touch on these 4 topics, but the first one may seem a little obvious, but it's who is the electric industry in the United States? Because we are a part of that, but we're a small part of it. So what I wanted to do is just hit the 3 big types of electric companies, and all this is moving us towards change and the way we process change and address change. But first, let's set the stage. So municipal electric systems, that's what we are. We all know that, right? We are a division of the city of Huntsville. In our city fathers' infinite wisdom, they decided to acquire the assets of Alabama Power in this region and to provide this as a city service to not only Huntsville but all of Madison County. So municipal electric systems are what we are, but we are the small little group. There are 2,000, more than 2,000 municipal electric systems in the United States. But get this, they tend to be really, really, really small. So Huntsville Utilities is, I think, the 16th or 17th largest municipal electric system in the United States of America. So let's put that in context. Munis serve about 15% of the population of the United States, 7% of the electric lines. They got started, when they get started? Well, they got started when electricity got started. They got started at the very beginning. Why? Because these little towns, which, you know, all towns were kind of little in the 1880s, except for a handful of big ones. They found out about Edison and about all these new technologies that were available, and they wanted it for their town too. But the privately owned power companies obviously went where they could make money, which was bigger cities. And so these rural towns wanted the service, and the only way they were going to get the service was doing it themselves. And so they bought a generator, and they ran some wires, and they hooked them up and powered the courthouse square. The very first utility I worked in, that's how it got started. There was a flour mill in that town. And that flour mill worked by, there was a river that ran through town, and they diverted the river into a little narrow channel. Well, if you take a volume of water and you restrict it, you increase the velocity, right? There's a bunch of engineers in the room. Y'all know this, right? So they increased that velocity and ran it through what they called the mill race. And the mill race ran under the mill and turned the millstone. That's how it all worked. That's how it worked for 100 years. And then they realized, well, sometimes the river's low and sometimes the river's high. And it'd be nice to have production consistent. And so they bought a generator, and I'm sure it was a little put generator, but it made electricity enough to turn the millstone. Well, at night, they didn't run the mill. So they talked to the city, and the city ran power lines from that mill over, which was only a couple of blocks, over to light the courthouse square. And then the city ended up buying that generator and selling power then to the mill. And then they got a bigger generator, and they ran lights to the next block and the next block and the next block, and then before you know it, you have a municipal electric system. It just started that simply in most of the United States. And that's why munis tend to be in small rural communities. So some serve large cities, 85% serve communities with less than 10,000 people. 30 systems in the United States serve more than 100,000 customers, and we're one of those. So again, we're kind of small. Most munis either own their own electric generation or participate in what's known as a joint action agency. A joint action agency is where a group of munis get together and collectively own a generation plant. That's not the way we work here, but that's the way most munis do it. When I was outside the valley, we had our own generating plant. We made our own electricity, and then we bought electricity from others as well. So this number down here is for comparison. On average, there's 48 customers and they collect $113,000 per mile of distribution line. Okay? That's just for comparisons. So we'll get to the comparison in a second. Some of the benefits of being a municipal electric system are for the city, they get a payment in lieu of tax. We're part of the city, so we don't pay taxes. But guess what? The city felt like, well, come on, we can come up with something. And so as an industry, we do something called a payment in lieu of tax, which is really a payment that looks a lot like a tax. I consider it like shareholder equity. That instead of paying a shareholder dividend, we pay the city this pilot fee, which is a percentage. It's a calculation, but basically it's a percentage of revenue, and all states do it differently. Huntsville and everyone in the Tennessee Valley, we pay a fairly low payment in lieu of tax to the city, between 2.5%, maybe 3%. Outside the valley can be a big number. I've heard as high as 8, 9, 10% of gross revenues go over to the city. They buy fire trucks. They buy all kinds of stuff with that money. I've heard of some cities where they have no property tax, everything's funneled through the electric system. That doesn't seem quite right to me. But anyway, I'm just saying that to say that places do it different ways in different communities. A lot of times they do cost savings. You know, you can help with the Christmas tree lights and all this other stuff. My point here is that outside the Tennessee Valley, we have a fairly rigid demarcation between this is the electric utility and this is city functions. Outside the Tennessee Valley, when you don't have TVA serving in that regulatory role, it gets real confusing. What is a city function and what is a utility function? Because it's kind of whatever the mayor says it is. And so munis tend to get kind of, sometimes you're viewed like a public works employee and sometimes you're viewed as part of the electric industry. Just sort of a weird thing about our business. We loan money and we borrow money in different ways. I'm going to skip those, but it just some of the nuances of being a muni. Let's talk about the other group that we have here in the valley, and that's cooperatives. So Joe Wheeler is an electric cooperative. They are different. There are about 900 of them, and they serve just 13% of Americans. So munis serve 15, co-ops serve 13. But get this, they're responsible for 42% of the electric lines in the United States. We serve, what was it, about 15%? What was it? No, 7. We serve 7%. They serve 42% of the electric lines that exist in the United States. On those 42% of electric lines, that's 13% of Americans. Amazingly, 75% of the land mass of this country is served by co-ops. But it's the land mass where nobody lives. So there's not a lot of density there. So they were created as part of Roosevelt's New Deal to get electrification out into, you know, from sea to shining sea. And they accomplished that mission very nicely. But an important thing to understand about co-ops is they're not like us. We are a unit of government. Co-ops are not. They're a private business. They're a private business set up in a not-for-profit basis. So they're, if you will, like think of your favorite charity, the Red Cross, or Second Mile if John were here. There's lots of, they're set up like that. They have their own private board, their own private rules. They operate according to the terms that they establish. So they're not a governmental unit, but they are a not-for-profit organization. And when you are a member of that co-op, you get to vote on who serves on the board. So that's how they're responsive to, that's how they're kind of under the umbrella of public power, because their customers have a say in the board that has a say in the operation of the utility. So this is a map that shows all the co-ops in the U.S., and I think the co-ops took liberties to draw these boundaries very generously, but in general, this is the map, and you can see there's co-ops all over the United States. So co-ops have principles. Every co-op, whether it's the farmer's co-op, the little telephone co-op, or your electric co-op, they're all founded under these 7 principles. I'm not going to go through those right now, but my point is that co-ops have an ethos and a guiding mission that drives them, and that's a big part of the culture of public power, and because co-ops are a very important part of that public power community. Well, let's talk about the non-public power, investor-owned. An investor-owned utility is a private power company. There's 200 of those, and they provide power to 72% of Americans. So they're the big dogs. They're responsible for about half the power lines in the United States. They typically dominate the industry. They set the tone when you're listening to the financial news and they talk about the utility stocks are trading higher today, blah, blah, blah. It's them. So we in the co-ops, even though they're 50% and we're about 50% of the power lines, because they serve most of the people and they serve most of the people in big cities, they get most of the attention. So why is there public power? Well, there is public power because we can focus exclusively on what's best for this community. We don't have to worry about distant shareholders. We don't have to worry about return on equity the way we do. We can make decisions on what's best for this community at this time and listen, have our antennas up, listen to our policymakers, both at the boards here and at City Council, and listen to our own customers, and hopefully make the right decision for the long term and don't have to make decisions just based on meeting quarterly numbers so that some executive can get his bonus and move on to the next job. You know, we can have a little bit longer perspective in the way that we think about things. So we are a local business and we support local businesses. But one of the bullet points I have on here is as the community grows, so grows the utility. So if the community is struggling, the utility is struggling. When the community is growing, the utility gets to keep up with that growth. And one of the things that's difficult for a utility, and I talk about it here on the next slide of some of the challenges, it's difficult when the community, it's difficult to assess what happens when the utility has either too much money or too little money. When it has too much money, everyone feels like, oh, they're taking advantage of us, or they're not a bank, and why do they have all that money? And when they don't have enough money, it's, oh God, what are we going to do? How are we going to keep it going? So we have to try to thread the needle. We have to keep it right in line. And Ted and his staff, that's what they try to do. Try to keep it right in line. We set benchmarks and comparisons and try to say, okay, this is appropriate, this is not appropriate. This is dangerous, we're safe here. So it's a lot of judgment calls that get put in place there. I put down here on challenges about local political cycles. Again, we're listening to those policymakers, right? Well, those policymakers change. As well they should. I mean, you got to get you know, new perspectives in, but that also means that there's churn and there's change and there's different perspectives. And this bottom bullet point, everyone takes it personally, especially in the South. Right? I was born in the South and my family's from the South, but I lived all over Texas, California, Michigan. I've sort of traveled around. And when I started in the utility industry in Michigan, you could fuss and fight and go to a city council meeting and just stand at the podium and rah-rah, make your points. And then guess what you did? After the meeting, everyone went to the bar and had a drink. You just moved on and started talking about, you know, your favorite team and everyone had a good time. But in the South, it doesn't work that way. When you get at that podium, rah-rah, then it's, when you challenge me, you have challenged me as a gentleman. Oh, wow. You have dishonored my family somehow. And my children and their children's children will not be able to stand with you. It's sort of, we take this, when we sort of make it personal. And I'm not saying that's exclusively a Southern trait. I do think it's amplified in the South. That we have a hard time separating sort of a business argument from my personal credibility. And I do think outside in other parts of the country that's not quite so prevalent. So it's important when I came and started working in the South to remember that when I talk to customers and when I talk to coworkers, that people really mean it. They mean it in a powerful way. And you can't just say, oh, well, that's the idea, but that's not the person. The person and the ideas get intermingled here in a way that I think is a little more close to the bone than in other places. So as a public power system where we are responsible to the public and responsible for listening to policymakers, it makes it even more important for us to be sensitive to those customers and those policymakers and those others to make sure that we are being responsive to those needs, but at the same time carrying a consistent message and a consistent delivery of service. So in the Valley, things are even more different. We've talked about munis, we've talked about co-ops, we've talked about investor-owns. What about TVA? Because TVA is something altogether different. It was also, like the co-ops, created as part of the New Deal during Roosevelt. And I'm not going to give a big TVA history lesson here. I'm going fast today because I know we got work to do. But it was started to make a difference and to make power less expensive because there were some smart people that said, you know what would be a catalyst of change in an area that was economically distressed, if we can come up with cheap resources, low-cost infrastructure, we can generate development. It was a bold idea. Using economic language, it was sort of like if you control the means of production, you can, benefit the people. And so that means of production was electricity. And so they stood up originally there was over in Muscle Shoals, there was a government facility over there, and they got Congress to pass a law that said, yeah, that facility over there in Muscle Shoals, you can put a dam on it, and you can generate electricity to power that government facility. And yeah, if you have any extra power, you can sell it to other people. Well, from that little crack, boom, TVA was formed. From you can sell surplus power out of the dam you're going to build at Muscle Shoals. From that formed the entire Tennessee Valley Authority. So it's amazing. People talk about being concerned about government expansion. That is a classic government expansion. If you still read the act and you go, you will hear it's talking about Muscle Shoals. Now it's talking about 7 states, right? 7-state region. So big changes that took place. But from that power plant, they built other dams and power plants along the river. And then that wasn't enough. And then they said, you know what? Let's build other kinds of power plants. And so they built coal power plants. And they built the largest coal power plants in the world here in the Tennessee Valley. They got very good at coal power plants. And then they thought, well, let's build nuclear power plants. So then the plan was they were going to build the biggest and best nuclear plants in the world. That didn't work out quite so well. There was a while when every single TVA nuclear plant was shut down because of safety concerns. And then they sort of had to build that program back from scratch. And now, of course, it is in good shape. But it is much smaller. It was originally, I think, supposed to be 17 reactors, and I think it's now 7 reactors that they have on the system. So its scope had to get a little bit more modest. I have a bullet on here that there was always been a tension between central planning and local control. When TVA was formed, they could have set it up just like an investor-owned utility. The local power was delivered by a TVA employee. The TVA employee is the one who read your meter and sent you a bill. They could have done that. Absolutely could have done that. That would have made, actually, probably more sense in some respects. They didn't do that. There was a guy at TVA who was one of the original board members appointed by by Roosevelt. He had a vision of local control. So he wanted Farmer Brown on the board and Banker Smith on the board of a local utility that would be responsive to that community's needs. So that they didn't come in as high, we're here from the federal government, we're here to help you. It was people they knew, people they went to church with, people they ran into the grocery store. That was one of the wisdoms when they set up TVA, is not to just set up a federal entity that owned it all the way from top to bottom, but to instead get the benefit where mass accumulation of resources made sense, and then allow that dispersion of local abilities where it made sense. So it was interesting that they set it up that way, but that has created tension between us. When we look at our peers outside the valley, they are responsible for generating their own power or buying their own power and managing their own energy transmission access and all that stuff. Well, we don't do that because TVA does those services, so we are set up differently, and that creates challenges both from our perspective and from TVA's perspective. It's kind of weird. We are different, and there's no one else quite like us in the country. I throw this in here, and I use this slide when I talk to TVA groups. This guy, David Lilienthal, he had very bold ambitions for what this was supposed to be. And this was a quote that he shared. He said, "We're in considerable danger of running the electricity program as if it were a private utility. A good, well-organized, efficient private utility, but a utility nevertheless." He didn't want TVA to be a utility, which of course is what it is today. Their grand vision was it was supposed to be a government overlay that administered all federal programs within its district. It was going to be a completely new thing. And so during the Lilienthal era, all USDA programs, there were no USDA programs. They were TVA programs. That's how TVA created the modern fertilizer industry. When it came to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, there was no U.S. Fish and Wildlife. That's why TVA controlled the rivers and everything that was around the rivers. That's why in the 70s, when the Clean Air and Clean Water Act passed, TVA said those don't apply to us. If Congress meant for that to apply to us, they would have put it in the TVA Act. We are separate and apart from all other federal regulation. We are unique. We are a federal district. Well, that didn't hold water. That's how all those nuclear plants got shut down, because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said, au contraire, you follow our rules and we're shutting all your plants down. So the grand vision of TVA was to be the instrument of federal power within this region. But it didn't turn out that way. But it did start that way. So I use this as a little point of perspective that things change in our industry, and sometimes that change catches us by surprise because it happens slowly. That sounds counterintuitive, right? Usually change catches you by surprise when it just gets dropped on you. But I think change catches you by surprise when it changes slowly, and then you look back and you realize, well, crap, things are different than they used to be. Because each step of the way kind of made sense at the time, and then you realize I'm in a different place than I was when I started. And I think that as an industry is what's happening to us right now. So we've got a bunch of national issues, and I'm not going to go through these, but I just want y'all to understand these are the hot button issues that we're wrestling with. Cybersecurity gets a lot of attention right now. Ron's back there, and he knows that. We've got these things called distributed energy resources, which is customer-based generation. That's changing our whole thought process. That's one of those things that it's going to be that slow incremental change that we look back and we realize we're in a completely different industry than the people 30 years ago were dealing with. We have issues just within the Tennessee Valley. First one on the list is wholesale competitiveness. Are TVA's prices still appropriate and reasonable? That's something we're working through with TVA. We talked about this grid access charge. That's something we talked a lot about in the rates. TVA moving for a fixed cost component of their bills. There's all kinds of issues on here. And I put this list up here because I'm not saying that these things are changes we see coming down the road. I'm saying these are things that are actively being debated every day. I'm in meetings weekly on at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 of these topics. This stuff is happening right now, and we don't know the answers to several of these questions. I'm on a group right now that does this integrated resource planning. What the heck does that mean? It lays out TVA's 20-year plan for its power supply needs. Where are we going to get our electricity from over the next 20 years? That is a hard answer to arrive at right now because usage is declining and on-site generation for customers is getting cheaper. Fixed cost of big power plants have debt that still have to be paid. We're trying to figure all that out. And it's an exciting time, but an uncertain time. I put regulatory confusion here because TVA serves as our regulator, but the TVA Act says TVA's board may establish those rules and regulations within its power contracts. And I'm making some leaps of connecting some phrases together to make that point. But what if TVA regulates us about something that's not in the power contract? How does that work? Or what if a utility refuses to sign a power contract amendment related to a point of regulation? What happens then? Right now we don't know. Probably there are going to be some court cases that have to figure that out. So we are redefining our industry by simple decisions, one meeting at a time. And that's often the way change happens. So we have some conundrums here. These conundrums are wrestling with two visions in the valley. Do local utilities exist to deliver TVA's power? Or does TVA exist simply to supply us and be our vendor? So you get the difference? It's sort of a power question, right? The other kind of power. Is TVA a useful convenience for us as a way to enable our customers to get low-cost power? And if they stop being a useful convenience to us, as an ability to get low-cost power, then we, as the local utility, should go out and find another source of power that works. Or TVA was the prime mover. They created the co-ops. They signed contracts with local municipalities. We are a convenient resource for them, almost like a franchise operator. We're like the McDonald's. Mr. Smith owns the local McDonald's, but the name on the billboard is McDonald's, not Mr. Smith's, right? That difference between being a franchisee of the TVA brand and being the local power company, autonomous, who is simply chosen. We're McDonald's today, we could be Burger King tomorrow. That tension is really coming to a head right now as instead of growth, electricity is always going more. It's becoming a question of how do we pay for what we already have, not how do we buy what we need in the future. It's interesting how that tension between who is ultimately responsible for serving the community, that question is in the air. What's the role of local utilities with integrating distributed energy resources or local generation into the mix? TVA's got all these power plants that have to be paid for. Well, if we support local customers setting up their own local generation, who's going to help pay for all those TVA power plants that were built for our customers' benefit? Well, we could say, TVA, that's your problem. They said, whoa, 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 whoa. We built that for your use. You can't just walk away. So that's, again, that tension's out there. How do we deal with declining energy sales and the potential impact of commercial and industrial customers installing on-site generation? But does the shift of revenue derived almost exclusively from consumption to fixed charges adversely impact low-income customers? That was something we just talked about for the last several weeks about our rate change. How do we manage this new dynamic? The way that utility rates were set up was convenient. When usage was always increasing, you could bet on the future just because the usage would always just sort of lift all the boats, right? And meters, it was just a simple, easy device. You could read the meter. It was just the way it was set up because it made sense at the time. That may not make sense 20 years from now. There may need to be different ways of doing it. That's why we've got new metering going into place. So, we as public power were created for a purpose, and we were created to serve this community and the people in this community. The reason why I throw these conundrums and questions up here is just to give you a sense of the fact that we have to, as a local utility, these industry dynamics, we navigate them. Always our guiding star is what's best for this community, Huntsville, Madison County. How does this community benefit? And our responsibility is to chart our course in a way that our ratepayers are ultimately protected and really enabled to take advantage of what's best for them. So that's the purpose of public power is not what is the most financially advantageous for us as an organization. We have to remain stable and strong so that this community can continue to get good resources and benefits. If we stop being the solution and we start becoming the problem, then this community needs to tell Huntsville Utilities, thank you very much, we've got another opportunity that we're going to pursue. So we have to stay relevant and purposeful to serve this community in this changing and dynamic world. So I have down here that leadership requires discernment of what actions are necessary and possible in the current environment. That's discernment. Discernment is understanding what is reasonable and appropriate. But discernment has to be joined with imagination. Because in times of change, effective leadership clarifies ambiguities. I just talked about a whole bunch of ambiguities, didn't I? A whole bunch of unknowns. A whole bunch of things that are slowly changing and some that are fast changing. And then we have to articulate a vision that reduces that uncertainty. And that's where imagination comes in. You have to have that spark of, given all this uncertainty, how do we chart our course forward? And sometimes discernment can get you there, but I don't think often it can. Discernment just lets you know what the battlefield looks like. It doesn't tell you how to win. That requires imagination, and imagination requires spirit and vision and really an excitement about what you're doing. And if you don't have an excitement about what you're doing, how can you bring that energy into a creative solution that gets other people on board. Just knowing the problem is important, right? It's the old 1980s G.I. Joe thing, knowing is half the battle. Yes, it's half the battle. What's the other half? The other half is solving it. The other half is having the imagination to say, given all this, let's talk about what's next. Let's talk about what's better. And that requires trial and error. It requires a little bit of grace, because it requires grace when management tries an idea. It may or may not work. Let's understand that it may or may not work. And when employees have an idea, let's have a little grace to say, you know what, that might work. Let's give it a try. So there's never perfection in our systems. We are human beings, and we stand up processes because we think it makes sense at the time, but we have to have the grace to operate and try what works and embrace what works and then set aside what doesn't work. So don't expect perfection either at any point in the process, because we are always hopefully good, smart, engaged, and active people doing the best we can and doing it collaboratively, which means there's going to be some trial and error involved. Okay? So let's talk about some things that I've noticed. I've been in this industry for 20 years. Some cultural dynamics that I've noticed that exist in this industry. And I describe it here as old school and imaginative. And I want you to just understand that this dynamic between old school and imaginative, these are caricatures, right? And these are inspirational thoughts. This is one of those don't do as I do, but do as I say kind of things, right? So I just want to set the context here. But these are just observations I've made over the years. So one of the things in the utility industry is this: sell what you got. You struggle to maintain interest in existing products and services. Milk as much as you can out of what you have. Hold on tight. Keep it going. A more imaginative solution is added value. Respond to a changing marketplace. Consider new products and services and features that add value to customers' lives. Okay, that just says, okay, we'll try to be open to new ideas. That one's pretty easy. Let's talk about reactive. Changes are viewed as uncontrolled. Focuses on maintaining the status quo and minimizing inconvenient changes. Often develops into a victim mentality. This was done to me. This change was brought onto me. And so now I'm just having to sort of protect as much as I can. A more imaginative approach is exploiting opportunities. Find opportunities to improve and go for them. Focus on service and improvement. Reward success and don't be afraid of setbacks. Having a little more courage. Stand up and say, you know what, given all of this, let's try this. Rather than hunkering down, stand up. Efficiency. In engineering and accounting, sorry Chad, obsession with efficiency can result in a decrease in customer service. While every decision is logical, that does not mean it's helpful to the customer. I'm big on efficiency. I love efficiency. Efficiency makes me feel like we're doing our job. So believe me, I own that old school right there. I own that. There's a challenge here with effectiveness. Focus on quality and then refine the process to keep quality, not consistency, number one. Careful planning is always important, and it improves employee morale and customer service. What improves employee morale and customer service? Careful planning. Isn't that interesting? Because planning seems kind of boring, but I think it's really important because it allows for communication and transparency and everyone to understand what's going on and why it's going on. So this one's a challenge. I think we live this every day, and we're going to continue to live this every day. How about this one? Loyalty. Employees do what they're told. In exchange, the organization provides a steady income for life. Results aren't important. The focus is on not screwing up. That's kind of part of our ethos, right? I remember I was at a different utility, and there was a woman who worked in customer service and had worked in customer service for many years. She had been there more than 50 years at that point. So many years is the right description there. I've talked about her in the past. She started working there when Kennedy was president. And what I observed in her interactions with the customer would come in with a problem and slide the bill across the counter and like, these things can't be right. And she would take that and she would go back and look at it and say, nope, we did all of our part right. Have a nice day. She didn't solve that customer's problem, but she realized, I didn't screw up. Now it's your fault. And that was her, as far as she was concerned, check, done. She didn't actually solve the customer's problem, didn't give them any information or help point them in a direction that made their life better. Entrepreneurial spirit. Employees are rewarded for making positive contribution to the organization, focus on results, and improving the process and customer experience. Again, aspirational, yes. How we do that in a daily life, interesting to figure out. But, you know, just something to think about. Finally, vertical. Built around a central decision maker, maybe me. Problems flow up, decisions flow down. Can form bottlenecks and personality conflicts between managers can wreak havoc throughout the organization. Horizontal. Employees are encouraged to reach out to others to solve problems. Focuses on finding solutions, not finding problems. Fosters a spirit of cooperation and transparency. It's another one that is aspirational, because there is always a tension there. You have to have, somebody has to make a decision and be responsible and need to know what's going on. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, all of a sudden it's anarchy and everybody makes every decision independently. That's not it. But we have to balance. There's a balance involved in these things. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this way is foolish and this way is neat. I'm saying that there is prudence and experience in this, but there is inspiration and imagination in this. How do we synergize it to do better for our customers and do better for our employees and do better for the future of this organization? So, this is one of my absolute favorite pictures. And it may take you a minute to process what's going on there, but many view that this is the way the world works. I hope not. But a couple of closing thoughts to leave you with. I'm doing pretty good on time. I'm kind of proud. Don't avoid awkward situations. Embrace honest, direct, and humble communication. Good to talk about things, but you have to talk about things in the right way. You have to talk about things, again, in the South, everyone does what? They take it personally. So recognize that when you present an issue, the person on the other end may think that you are challenging them as an individual, not the issue at hand, the abstract notion that you're talking about. So do it with a certain element of, another word that I've used today, grace. Certain element of grace and humility and understanding. I think the more that we can open ourselves up to grace and understanding, the better that we will all be as an organization. Respect what works, but don't be afraid of innovation. That tension is always going to be part of what we do. By our, in our bones is to do it the tried and true and understood way. That's just part of who we are. Let's not just think that we can throw that away and we'll be okay. That's ridiculous. Of course, we take all that wisdom and all that knowledge, but then we look for openings and for opportunities to establish a new way. One of the lines I heard when I got here is, you know, people don't like the phrase, well, that's the way we've always done it. And my response is, well, let's make the way we've always done it the right way. So let's figure out if the way we've always done it isn't meeting, if it's creating a conflict and a problem, let's have the freedom to open that up and establish that the way we do it is the right way. Now that doesn't mean, getting to my final point here, processes are not the enemy of innovation. Effective processes provide transparency, enable collaboration, and facilitate accountability. What do I mean by that? I mean that if it's just Wes made the decision and that's what we're going to have to do, well, if you have some sort of understanding and there is a process behind that, then others can interface with Wes. If Ted needs to work with Wes to solve a problem, if there's a process involved, it's not just it happened in the cloud of Wes's brain. There was a process that was followed, and Ted understands that and knows how to interject and say, hey, this part, I want to talk about this. You understand? A process flow, a process dynamic, anything like that, just provides sort of a schematic of a decision-making outcome. And if you document that out, then you can say, this part I get, this part I don't get. And again, it helps make it a less personal thing. Because now you're talking about a process and a way to improve a process, not I challenge your decision. No, let's lay out what the process was, and this step of the process I think could be better. It gives us a framework, an understanding, a dialogue of how to make our processes, our organization, our outcome to the customer better. Because we stop making it a little less personal about well, they just told me to do it this way. Understand, how did we get to that decision-making point? So, and it does facilitate accountability, because once there is something, once a process is in place, then we can say, did it generate the outcome that was intended? Well, we did something. Was it the right thing? Did we do what we said we were going to do? And did what we say we were going to do have the outcome to the customer that we hoped it would have? Did it have the outcome to our employees that we hoped it would have? Let's have the courage to ask that question. Just because we did it doesn't make it right. When we did it, let's scrutinize it after the fact and say, yep, it's what we needed to do. We did it. Or, you know what? It was close. It was better than what we had. It could be better. Let's go back and reevaluate that process and see how we can make things even better.